On a grey morning in the early 18th century, a British merchant ship moved across a restless sea beneath a sky the color of hammered lead. Her canvas was damp, her rigging groaned, and every timber in her hull answered the long Atlantic swell with a low complaint. Barrels of cloth, tools, metal goods, provisions, and private possessions were packed below deck, representing months of labor and a fortune that belonged not only to one merchant but to investors, insurers, sailors, and families waiting in distant ports. The men aboard understood that the ocean was not an empty road. It was a frontier without walls, crossed by royal warships, privateers, smugglers, pirates, fishing craft, and armed boats whose intentions could change with the wind. A lookout leaned forward and saw shapes gathering inside the haze. They were low against the water, smaller and faster than the merchantman, and they were approaching from more than one direction. The ship carried cannon, but the largest guns had been arranged to fight vessels of comparable size. They were devastating when a target remained broadside, yet cumbersome against small boats moving quickly toward the stern or bow. Sailors hurried to the rail with muskets and pistols. Each weapon offered one discharge before its owner had to begin the slow ritual of loading again. Powder had to remain dry, a ball had to be driven down a barrel, a flint had to strike steel strongly enough to create sparks. Under calm conditions, a trained man could perform these actions with confidence. On a rolling deck, under smoke and incoming fire, every movement became slower and more dangerous. Yet near the rail stood something unfamiliar. It rested upon a tripod and carried a long barrel like a small cannon, but behind that barrel was a metal cylinder containing several separate chambers. A crewman loosened a screw, turned the cylinder, locked the next chamber into alignment, prepared the flintlock, and fired. Smoke burst outward. Then the mechanism was turned again, bringing another prepared charge into position. The machine did not fire automatically, and it did not pour out an uninterrupted stream of bullets, but it promised something astonishing for its age: repeated fire without loading the same barrel from the muzzle after every shot. This imagined defense at sea captures the purpose of a weapon patented in 1718 by an English lawyer and writer named James Puckle. He called it the defense gun. Later generations would call it the Puckle Gun, and some would describe it as the first machine gun. That description is dramatic, memorable, and incomplete. The gun was manually operated. Its cylinder had to be turned by human hands, its flintlock prepared, and each chamber fired separately. There is no confirmed account of it defeating a boarding party, changing a battle, or saving a British ship. Very few examples were manufactured. The British military did not adopt it, and the project failed to create the profitable enterprise Puckle hoped to build. Yet the machine remains important because it expressed a question that would shape centuries of warfare. Could mechanical organization allow a small crew to fire more rapidly than men carrying ordinary muzzle-loading weapons? James Puckle offered an answer in iron, brass, wood, powder, and ambition. His answer worked well enough to be demonstrated, but not well enough to create the future he imagined. Yet the machine remains important because it expressed a question that would shape centuries of warfare. Could mechanical organization allow a small crew to fire more rapidly than men carrying ordinary muzzle-loading weapons? James Puckle offered an answer in iron, brass, wood, powder, and ambition. His answer worked well enough to be demonstrated, but not well enough to create the future he imagined. To understand why such a weapon appeared, it is necessary to enter Britain at the beginning of the 18th century, when the sea was becoming increasingly important to national wealth and power. Britain was not yet the uncontested maritime empire that later generations would remember, but ships already connected its ports to Europe, the Atlantic colonies, West Africa, the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, and the markets of Asia. Manufactured goods left English harbors. Sugar, tobacco, timber, metals, food, and countless other commodities returned. This expanding commerce produced profit, but it also produced rivalry. European governments fought wars that continued far beyond continental battlefields. A merchant ship might become a target because of the flag it flew, the cargo it carried, the port from which it sailed, or the political crisis unfolding hundreds of miles away. Privateers operated with official permission to attack enemy shipping. Pirates acted for themselves. Corsairs from North African ports raided vessels and coastal settlements, while European states carried out their own violent maritime campaigns. Religious language often simplified these conflicts into stories of Christians against Muslims, civilization against barbarism, or lawful commerce against piracy. The reality was more complex. Alliances shifted, governments negotiated, captives were exchanged or enslaved, and men described as pirates by one side might be regarded as legitimate fighters by another. For British merchants, however, complexity did not reduce fear. A ship taken at sea could mean lost cargo, ruined investors, imprisoned sailors, and devastated families. Naval protection, therefore, became a matter of both national policy and private calculation. A warship represented royal power, but most merchantmen could not expect permanent escort. They had to carry their own weapons and rely upon their crews. Heavy cannon could damage an enemy hull, tear rigging, and kill men with splinters, yet naval combat did not always remain at cannon range. When one vessel closed with another, the struggle could become personal. Grappling hooks secured the ships together. Armed men crossed narrow spaces between decks. Pistols fired at faces only a few feet away. Cutlasses, axes, pikes, and clubs replaced long-range weapons. A crew that had survived hours of cannon fire might lose everything in minutes after attackers gained the rail. The danger was even more severe when small, maneuverable boats approached a larger ship from directions its main guns could not easily cover. A mounted weapon capable of repeated fire appeared to offer a solution. It could be placed where attackers were expected to gather. It could launch several shots while musketeers were still reloading. It could serve as a mechanical guard over a narrow deck, gangway, harbor entrance, or fortification. That was the world in which James Puckle presented his defense gun. He did not invent fear of boarding, nor did he invent the desire for rapid fire. Volley guns, repeating firearm experiments, swivel guns, and cannon loaded with anti-personnel ammunition had appeared before him. His achievement was to combine familiar ideas in a distinctive patented system and to promote that system as a practical defense for Britain's ships and commerce. Boarding combat revealed the weakness of the ordinary flintlock weapon more clearly than almost any other situation. The standard musket was powerful, familiar, and relatively simple, but it demanded a sequence of actions after every discharge. The shooter took a cartridge, opened it, poured powder, inserted the projectile in paper, used the ramrod, returned the ramrod, prepared the priming charge, brought the weapon to the shoulder, aimed through smoke, and pulled the trigger. Brought the weapon to the shoulder, aimed through smoke, and pulled the trigger. Soldiers practiced until these motions became habit, and disciplined formations could maintain a rhythm of fire by ranks. Sailors defending a deck did not always have that order. The deck rolled. Spray struck the lock. Loose ropes lay underfoot. Men shouted contradictory warnings. Smoke drifted between masts. A wounded sailor could fall against another man in the middle of loading. A dropped ramrod might disappear between planks or slide beyond reach. Damp powder might flash weakly or not at all. During the time required to reload, an attacker could climb over the rail and close the distance with a blade. Pistols offered additional prepared shots, but a man could carry only so many. Swivel guns were useful and could fire clusters of small projectiles, yet they too had to be reloaded. Multi-barrel weapons could release a devastating volley, but after firing, they presented the same basic problem: empty barrels and a crew that needed time. Repeating systems promised to shift part of the labor away from the critical moment. Instead of measuring and loading every charge while the enemy approached, several charges could be prepared in advance. The weapon might then bring them into alignment one after another. In principle, this transformed time. Minutes of preparation and safety could become seconds of action during danger. The concept was simple. The construction was not. Each chamber had to contain powder securely. Each chamber had to align with the barrel. Ignition had to occur only where intended. Expanding gases had to travel forward rather than escaping backward toward the operator. Fouling from one discharge could not be allowed to stop the next. The mechanism had to endure recoil, heat, weather, and rough handling. It had to be made at a price customers were willing to pay. The machine also had to prove that it offered an advantage over several ordinary weapons operated by several ordinary men. This last point would haunt Puckle's project. A single unusual gun could fire more rapidly than one musket, but if it required multiple operators, expensive cylinders, skilled maintenance, and special training, a ship owner might decide that 3 sailors with familiar firearms were a safer investment. The defense gun therefore faced 2 tests. The first was mechanical. Could it fire repeatedly? The second was institutional. Could it persuade military officials, merchants, and investors that its increased speed justified everything else it demanded? Puckle would demonstrate that his gun could pass the first test under controlled conditions. He would never fully overcome the second. James Puckle was an unlikely figure to stand at the beginning of the story of rapid-firing weapons. He was not celebrated as a battlefield commander, a naval hero, or a master gunmaker. He was an English lawyer, writer, and promoter of ideas, a man whose interests included trade, fisheries, national prosperity, moral instruction, and public policy. Born in the 17th century and living into the early years of Georgian Britain, he belonged to a culture in which educated men often crossed boundaries that later became professional walls. A lawyer could write about commerce. A merchant could invest in engineering. A gentleman could seek a patent for a mechanical device without having forged every part himself. Puckle's published works show his concern with what he believed would increase England's wealth and honor. He wrote about wool, manufacturing, trade, and fisheries, presenting economic improvement as a patriotic project. His most famous literary work outside the gun was a moral dialogue between a father and son. These interests suggest a man who believed that organized thought and practical schemes could strengthen both individuals and the nation. The defense gun fitted that outlook. A weapon that protected ships could protect trade. Trade could create wealth. Wealth could support national power. National power could protect further trade. This circle of commerce and security was compelling in a country whose ambitions increasingly depended upon the sea. It is impossible to recover every private thought that led Puckle to his invention. Perhaps he began by studying the vulnerability of ships to boarding. Perhaps he encountered an earlier revolving firearm and imagined a larger version. Perhaps he recognized that fear of maritime attack could attract investors. Most likely, technical curiosity, patriotism, and business ambition combined. London offered an ideal environment for such a project. The city contained merchants discussing lost cargoes, government officials responsible for military supply, craftsmen capable of producing locks and barrels, printers ready to circulate proposals, coffee houses where ventures were debated, and wealthy men searching for profitable opportunities. Puckle could move between these worlds. He could describe a tactical problem in legal language, protect a design through a patent, promote it through print, and see capital through a company. Yet this same environment was unforgiving. Investors had seen grand promises collapse. Officials had examined ingenious devices that failed during trials. Craftsmen knew that drawings concealed practical difficulties. A machine could be admired and still remain unsold. Puckle's greatest challenge was not imagining repeated fire. It was coordinating law, metalwork, finance, military approval, and public trust. Every part of the venture had to function as reliably as the weapon itself. If the cylinder failed, the gun stopped. If investors failed, production stopped. If officials refused adoption, the market shrank. The defense gun was therefore more than a firearm. It was a commercial mechanism, and its most fragile components were human confidence and money. Before receiving his famous patent, Puckle sought the attention of the British authorities responsible for weapons and military supply. The Board of Ordnance was not merely a room filled with conservative officials who rejected anything unfamiliar. It managed a vast and difficult system of guns, ammunition, fortifications, stores, transport, contracts, and repairs. Every new weapon created new obligations. It had to be manufactured in sufficient numbers, inspected, distributed, explained to users, supplied with ammunition, repaired when broken, and incorporated into existing tactics. An inventor might look at his machine and see a brilliant solution. An ordnance official might see a long list of future expenses. Puckle presented his design around 1717 before the patent of the following year. Surviving accounts indicate that it did not win official adoption. The exact conversation is lost, but the likely concerns can be understood from the machine itself. It was more complicated than a musket and more mechanically demanding than a simple swivel gun. Its rotating cylinder required close fitting. Its flintlock ignition remained vulnerable to damp and fouling. Its tripod and frame added weight. Its rate of fire had to be considered against crew requirements. Its cylinders would have to be produced accurately enough to work with the barrel. A damaged screw or misaligned chamber could stop the entire weapon. At sea, salt, spray, movement, and neglect could make every weakness worse. The board also had to compare the defense gun with weapons already available. A ship could carry several muskets for the cost of one complex machine. Sailors understood those muskets. Armorers knew how to repair them. Ammunition could be supplied through familiar channels. Cannon and swivel guns already provided anti-personnel fire. Puckle had to prove not simply that his gun was clever, but that it was sufficiently better to justify changing the system around it. This distinction is essential when judging the rejection. The history of invention is often told as a drama between genius and blindness, with the visionary creator opposed by foolish authorities. Sometimes that story is true. More often, institutions hesitate because a promising mechanism has not yet become a dependable system. The board's refusal did not prove that Puckle lacked imagination. Sometimes that story is true. More often, institutions hesitate because a promising mechanism has not yet become a dependable system. The board's refusal did not prove that Puckle lacked imagination. Nor did it prove that the officials lacked intelligence. It showed that the defense gun had entered the hardest stage of invention, the point at which an object must survive comparison with cheaper, simpler, and familiar alternatives. Puckle did not surrender. He turned to the law, securing a patent that would protect his claim and give him a powerful document for future promotion. If the state would not immediately become his customer, perhaps legal recognition and public demonstration would help him build a private market. Perhaps legal recognition and public demonstration would help him build a private market. In 1718, James Puckle received a British patent for the weapon he called a portable gun or machine named a defense. The patent is important not only because of the firearm it described, but because it appeared during a period when British patent practice increasingly required inventors to explain the nature of their inventions and the manner in which they operated. Earlier patents could be vague grants of privilege. Puckle's document included a detailed illustrated explanation, allowing viewers to see the machine's long barrel, revolving chambers, supporting frame, and operating parts. Puckle's document included a detailed illustrated explanation, allowing viewers to see the machine's long barrel, revolving chambers, supporting frame, and operating parts. The drawing made the invention visible to men who might never stand beside a working example. It transformed the gun into an argument. Here, Puckle could show order where a battlefield offered confusion. Each component occupied its place. The cylinder carried prepared charges. The barrel directed the projectile. The tripod supported the weapon. The screw locked a chamber into position. The flintlock ignited the powder. In the clean lines of an engraving, nothing rusted, jammed, swelled, cracked, or misfired. A patent, however, was not a military certificate. It did not guarantee that the machine worked safely, that customers would purchase it, or that craftsmen could reproduce it economically. The patent gave Puckle a temporary legal advantage and a public claim to the design. Everything else remained to be achieved. He still needed capital, manufacturers, demonstrations, and buyers. He also needed a story powerful enough to connect the mechanism to national need. The name defense gun performed part of that work. It emphasized protection rather than aggression. The name defense gun performed part of that work. It emphasized protection rather than aggression. The weapon was presented as a guard for ships and positions threatened by concentrated attack. This language mattered. A merchant might hesitate to invest in an experimental killing machine, but feel differently about a device described as protecting sailors, cargo, and national commerce. Puckle's promotion repeatedly connected technical speed to moral and patriotic purpose. Yet the weapon's design makes clear that defense could be violently destructive. A mounted gun firing large projectiles or multiple small shot into men crowded inside boats would cause terrible injuries. Like many weapons, it was advertised through the lives it might save on one side, while its effectiveness depended upon the lives it could destroy on the other. The patent also encouraged later generations to treat Puckle as a prophetic inventor. Its date, 1718, stands more than a century before the Gatling gun and far earlier than practical automatic weapons. The visual resemblance of the cylinder to a revolver invites comparison with later firearms. But the true significance lies not in pretending that Puckle secretly invented a modern gun. It lies in understanding how he reorganized the labor of loading. Several charges were prepared in separate chambers, and the operator brought each chamber behind a single barrel. The machine remained dependent upon human hands, yet those hands no longer performed the entire muzzle-loading sequence after every shot. Puckle had attempted to store readiness inside the weapon. The operation of the defense gun was ingenious, deliberate, and far removed from modern automatic fire. The weapon stood on a tripod that raised the barrel to a useful height and allowed it to be aimed. Behind the long single barrel sat a detachable revolving cylinder containing several chambers. Surviving examples and illustrations show variations in the number of chambers, but the central principle remained the same. Each chamber could be loaded in advance with powder and a projectile. The cylinder was then fitted onto the central mechanism. To prepare a shot, the operator brought one chamber into line with the rear of the barrel. A threaded screw and crank were used to press the chamber tightly against the barrel, creating the best seal the technology could provide. The flintlock was prepared. When the trigger mechanism operated, a piece of flint struck steel, producing sparks that ignited priming powder. Flame passed to the main charge. Expanding gas drove the projectile forward through the barrel. After firing, the operator loosened the screw, freeing the cylinder enough to rotate. The next chamber was moved into position, the screw tightened again, and the lock prepared for another discharge. This sequence could be repeated until the cylinder was empty. The empty cylinder could then be removed and replaced with another that had already been loaded. In theory, a supply of prepared cylinders allowed the gun to continue firing with shorter pauses than a conventional muzzle loader. Its central weakness lay at the junction between cylinder and barrel. Even slight misalignment could send a projectile against the edge of the bore, while an imperfect seal allowed hot gas and burning powder to escape near the crew. That leakage reduced power and made repeated firing more hazardous. Residue stiffened the mechanism, heated metal expanded, and salt encouraged corrosion. Rough handling could damage the threaded screw that locked each chamber in place. Such problems did not reflect poor craftsmanship. 18th century metalworkers produced remarkable objects, but a carefully fitted prototype was very different from hundreds of standardized weapons. A cylinder made for one gun might not fit another without filing an adjustment, particularly in a distant port with limited tools, nor did the mechanism advance by itself. After every discharge, an operator had to release the chamber, rotate the cylinder, lock the next charge behind the barrel, nor did the mechanism advance by itself. After every discharge, an operator had to release the chamber, rotate the cylinder, lock the next charge behind the barrel, prepare the flintlock, and fire. This saved time compared with loading the same muzzle from the front, yet it still demanded skill and concentration. Several charged chambers also sat close together, where stray sparks or escaping flame created the risk of an accidental chain ignition. Covers and alignment devices were intended to reduce that danger, but safety ultimately depended on precise construction, careful maintenance, and a disciplined crew. The gun therefore occupied an uncertain space between artillery and small arms. It resembled a small cannon in size and mounting, but safety ultimately depended on precise construction, careful maintenance, and a disciplined crew. The gun therefore occupied an uncertain space between artillery and small arms. It resembled a small cannon in size and mounting, a revolver in its cylinder, and a musket in its flintlock ignition. That combination made it fascinating to observers and difficult for institutions to classify. Who should operate it? Where should it be placed? What ammunition system should support it? How many cylinders should accompany each gun? How many men were needed to maintain an effective rate? A weapon becomes practical when such questions have routine answers. For the defense gun, they remained part of the experiment. Puckle's most notorious promotional idea concerned the shape of the projectiles. For the defense gun, they remained part of the experiment. Puckle's most notorious promotional idea concerned the shape of the projectiles. His patent material distinguished between ordinary round bullets and square bullets, associating the round form with Christian enemies and the square form with Muslim opponents. The square projectile was advertised as causing greater suffering, and the proposal was wrapped in religious hostility presented as patriotic virtue. Modern retellings often seize upon this detail because it is strange, cruel, and memorable. It must be understood within the propaganda of the period without being excused by that context. European writers of the period often described conflict with Muslim powers in the language of an absolute civilizational struggle. Raiding from North African ports, Ottoman military strength, captivity, slavery, and generations of religious warfare created fears that politicians and merchants readily exploited. Puckle turned those fears into advertising. His proposed square projectile implied that a designated enemy deserved a more painful form of violence, although no convincing evidence shows that such ammunition was ever used in combat. Its practical value was doubtful as well. An irregular shape could complicate loading, weaken the gas seal, damage the bore, and produce unstable flight. The idea may therefore have been more useful on paper than at sea. Even so, it reveals how closely technology and culture were intertwined. The same patent that displayed mechanical ingenuity also carried the prejudices of its age. That contradiction makes the defense gun difficult to celebrate as an uncomplicated triumph. Its enduring technical importance lies not in the shape of its ammunition, but in the detachable revolving chambers that brought several prepared charges behind one barrel. The square bullet addressed emotion and prejudice. The cylinder addressed a genuine tactical problem. Together, they show that inventors seldom sell mechanisms alone. They also sell stories about danger, identity, protection, and survival. Puckle invited potential supporters to imagine disciplined British sailors using mechanical ingenuity against a feared enemy. In that vision, investment became patriotism and violence became defense. A responsible history must preserve both sides of the story. The weapon was a creative experiment in repeated fire, and its promotion included a calculated appeal to religious hostility. Any truthful account of the defense gun must therefore hold two ideas together. The weapon was a creative experiment in rapid fire, and its promotion included a calculated appeal to religious hatred. Neither fact cancels the other. Turning the patent drawing into a working weapon required a network of craftsmen whose names have not survived with the fame of Puckle's own. Gun barrels had to be forged or cast and carefully finished. Locks demanded springs, screws, hardened steel, and precise contact between flint and frizzen. Cylinders required chambers bored at consistent angles and depths. The central screw had to move smoothly while holding the chamber tightly against the barrel. The tripod had to support the weapon's weight and recoil without preventing aim. Handles, covers, pins, and fittings had to survive repeated use. Brass or iron components had to be shaped with files, drills, lathes, hammers, and measuring tools, guided by practiced eyes and hands. In an 18th century workshop, precision was personal. A master craftsman judged fit through resistance, sound, alignment, and experience. Apprentices worked bellows, carried metal, cleaned surfaces, and learned by repetition. Oil, charcoal, filings, and smoke filled the space. A part that appeared finished might return to the bench again and again because one edge caught, one screw bound, or one chamber failed to meet the barrel correctly. The defense gun multiplied such opportunities for failure. A single-shot musket needed one barrel, one lock, and a stock arranged through familiar methods. Puckle's weapon added a series of loaded chambers and a mechanism for presenting each one safely. Every chamber had to perform like the others. A small variation became a repeated weakness. The more cylinders a customer purchased, the more expensive the complete system became. Yet without spare-loaded cylinders, one of the weapon's main advantages disappeared after the first series of shots. Cost therefore increased with tactical usefulness. The gun also needed equipment for loading, cleaning, maintenance, and transport. The ship owner was not buying one object, but a chain of obligations. Puckle's title appeared on the patent, and his vision drove the venture. But the practical gun emerged from collaborative labor. This is true of many inventions remembered through a single name. The inventor identifies, combines, protects, and promotes an idea, while anonymous or less celebrated workers determine whether that idea can exist in matter. If the surviving Puckle guns are impressive today, part of that credit belongs to the craftsmen who transformed an ambitious engraving into aligned chambers and working locks. Their achievement should not be confused with mass production capability. A magnificent prototype could be made by skilled hands at great cost. Military adoption required many guns made consistently, supported by spare parts, and repaired by armorers who had not participated in their construction. Puckle's project lived at the boundary between craft and industry. It asked craft production to supply a machine whose greatest potential would only be realized in a later world of standardized components and reliable manufacturing. The weapon could be built. The harder question was whether it could be built often, cheaply, and consistently enough to matter. The most famous evidence that the defense gun could perform came from a public trial in 1722. Accounts report that the weapon fired 63 shots in 7 minutes, approximately 9 shots per minute, despite rainy conditions. For an audience familiar with muzzle-loading firearms, this was an impressive display. Imagine the preparation. The gun stood upon its tripod as observers gathered at a safe distance. Investors and officials examined the cylinder, perhaps searching for hidden weakness. Crewmen protected powder from the weather. Loaded chambers were arranged. Rain threatened the flintlock, the priming charge, and the confidence of everyone involved. Puckle's reputation depended upon a chain of sparks, seals, rotations, and human motions functioning repeatedly in public. The first shot alone would prove little. The value lay in the second, third, and continuing discharges, each arriving before an ordinary musketeer could complete another loading cycle. Smoke gathered around the weapon. The screw was loosened and tightened, and the cylinder turned. Flint struck steel. The barrel discharged again. By the end of 7 minutes, 63 reported shots had created a statistic that would survive for centuries. The celebrated figure of 63 shots in 7 minutes must be treated with care. A public trial used prepared equipment and operators familiar with the mechanism. A real boarding action offered a moving deck, incoming fire, wet powder, dropped cylinders, neglected parts, and fear. 7 successful minutes could not reveal how the weapon would perform after months of salt exposure or rough handling. Its rate also had to be compared with the combined fire of every sailor required to operate it, not simply with one musketeer. Projectile weight further complicated the comparison, because the defense gun may have delivered a heavier ball or a cluster of smaller shot. Even with those qualifications, the demonstration mattered. It showed that Puckle's design was more than an engraving. The cylinder could be rotated, the chambers could fire in sequence, and rain did not silence the system completely. What the trial supplied was evidence of function, not proof of military suitability. Puckle now possessed a performance claim he could present to potential supporters. Yet what he needed was not applause, but capital. 63 shots could make smoke, noise, and an impression. They could not guarantee orders. The trial proved a narrow fact. A prepared Puckle gun could fire rapidly for 7 minutes under demonstration conditions. It did not prove that Britain should manufacture hundreds, place them aboard ships, train crews, and maintain them across the empire. That larger proof required money, institutions, and trust. These were exactly the resources Puckle struggled to obtain. The early 18th century was an age of expanding investment and dangerous speculation. Joint stock companies promised access to trade, land, manufacturing, and overseas profit. Coffee houses carried rumors that could raise or destroy confidence. Printed proposals presented canals, fisheries, colonies, engines, and military devices as opportunities for both patriotism and wealth. Investors understood that one successful enterprise could create a fortune. They also knew that grand schemes could collapse, leaving shareholders with paper and regret. Puckle entered this culture by attempting to organize financial support for his gun. He needed funds to pay craftsmen, purchase materials, conduct demonstrations, advertise, and create enough weapons to attract official or commercial customers. His argument was plausible. British trade depended upon ships. Ships faced boarding attacks. A rapid-firing defensive machine could reduce losses. Merchant companies, naval authorities, colonial ventures, or wealthy ship owners might buy the weapon. If even a fraction of Britain's armed vessels adopted it, the market could be substantial. But investors asked questions the patent could not answer. Had the Royal Navy approved it? Could ordinary sailors use it? How often did boarding attacks create the exact situation the gun was designed to solve? Would one machine be more effective than several swivel guns or muskets? Could it survive salt water? How much would spare cylinders cost? Who would repair it in Barbados, Jamaica, or the Mediterranean? Would the maker guarantee replacement parts? Could foreign governments copy it despite the patent? Every uncertain answer increased risk. The venture became an object of satire. A contemporary joke suggested that the only people wounded by the gun were those who held shares in it. The humor was effective because it converted the weapon's purpose into a comment on financial loss. Puckle promised a machine that would wound attackers. Critics saw a company that wounded investors. Satire could be fatal to a speculative project because confidence was part of its machinery. A gun company without orders appeared weak. Weakness discouraged new investment. Lack of investment prevented further production and trials. The absence of trials made official adoption less likely. The cycle turned against Puckle. It is tempting to say that investors lacked vision, but their hesitation was understandable. The gun remained expensive, unusual, and officially unapproved. Its commercial success depended upon a future market rather than existing contracts. Puckle had developed an answer before proving that enough customers recognized the problem in the same way. This is one of the most common failures in invention. A creator sees technical possibility. Buyers see cost, uncertainty, and alternatives. The defense gun could impress a crowd and still fail as a business. In the end, Puckle's project demonstrated that mechanical innovation alone does not create adoption. A weapon needs a network of confidence connecting inventor, manufacturer, investor, official, operator, and supplier. Puckle built the cylinder. He never built that network strongly enough. One prominent supporter did bring the defense gun closer to an overseas military venture. John Montague, the second Duke of Montague, purchased at least 2 examples associated with an expedition to the Caribbean in 1722. Shipping records referred to them as machine guns of Puckle, an early appearance of the expression machine gun. The phrase should not be read with its modern meaning. It described a gun whose operation depended upon a machine, not a firearm that automatically continued firing as long as a trigger was held. Even so, the words show that contemporaries recognized something mechanically unusual about Puckle's design. The Duke's expedition was directed toward St. Lucia and St. Vincent, islands already inhabited and contested within the violent system of European colonial expansion. Private ambition, government authority, trade, and territorial claims overlapped. To European planners, islands could appear on maps as opportunities for settlement and profit. To the people living there, an expedition represented intrusion, dispossession, and war. Disease, resistance, logistics, and political complications could destroy a colonial scheme before its promoters secured what they sought. Puckle's guns may have been intended to protect ships, landing parties, temporary positions, or stores. Their concentrated fire could theoretically defend a narrow approach against attackers. The guns were probably intended to guard ships, landing parties, stores, or narrow approaches, but no reliable evidence places them in combat. A shipping record proves that the machines were sent with the venture. It does not tell us that they were unpacked, mounted, or fired against an enemy. They may have remained in storage, arrived too late, or simply never encountered the situation Puckle had imagined. The expedition therefore brought the defense gun closer to war without giving it a documented battlefield history. The surviving Montague examples are important because they confirm that the invention advanced beyond patent drawings and public trials, not because they can be linked to a victory. For Puckle, the Duke's purchase must have represented a rare moment when promotion became an order. A wealthy patron had accepted the machine's potential and sent it toward a real expedition, but the venture produced no wave of demand. Other patrons did not follow in sufficient numbers. The British military did not reverse its decision. The defense gun remained an experiment carried by hope, rather than a standard weapon carried by fleets. Its journey toward the Caribbean brought it geographically closer to war, while leaving it historically outside confirmed battle. Why then did the Puckle gun fail? Saying that it appeared before its time is only a starting point. Its difficulties formed a chain in which each weakness strengthened the next. Mechanically, the design demanded more from its users and makers than familiar muskets or swivel guns. A chamber had to align closely with the barrel. The screw had to lock without damage, and the flintlock had to ignite one prepared charge after another. Fouling, recoil, heat, and corrosion all threatened that sequence. At sea, the environment magnified every flaw. Spray dampened powder, salt attacked iron. Wooden supports shifted with moisture, and a weapon adjusted in a London workshop might behave very differently after weeks aboard a rolling ship. Expense created another barrier. Skilled labor, additional metal, maintenance tools, and several accurately fitted cylinders made the complete system costly. Buying only one cylinder reduced the price, but also weakened the principal advantage, because the crew would face a long pause once its chambers were empty. Existing weapons also offered credible alternatives. Swivel guns could scatter small shot across an approaching boat, while muskets and pistols were familiar, mobile, and supported by established supplies. Several sailors, armed conventionally, might produce a combined rate comparable to one mounted defense gun, and the loss of a single musket would not disable the entire defense. Puckle's weapon concentrated fire, but it also concentrated vulnerability. An enemy marksman could target the operator, and damage to the lock, cylinder, or tripod might silence the whole apparatus. Supply and training were equally important. A new military weapon required instructions, spare parts, armorers, standardized ammunition, and officers who understood where it belonged tactically. Those networks were expensive without large orders, while large orders were unlikely until the networks already existed. Nor did Britain face a crisis severe enough to make officials accept every uncertainty. Puckle had a plausible danger and an impressive demonstration, but no powerful institutional sponsor capable of forcing extensive trials and production. The defense gun therefore fell into the gap between invention and innovation. Puckle created a functioning mechanism. He did not create an affordable, reproducible, and fully supported military system. Later, rapid-fire weapons succeeded only after cartridges, improved metallurgy, industrial machinery, and dependable manufacturing altered the conditions around the gun. His design was not a modern weapon accidentally stranded in 1718. It was an ambitious product of 1718, carrying the possibilities and limitations of that world in every chamber. Screw and spark. It was a weapon shaped by the limitations of its own century, and those limitations were present in every spark, screw, chamber, and investment proposal. The claim that Puckle invented the first machine gun has kept his name alive, but it depends on a definition the weapon does not meet. A modern automatic gun uses recoil, expanding gas, or another power source to continue the loading and firing cycle, while ammunition remains available. Puckle's system relied on an operator who loosened the screw, rotated the cylinder, locked the next chamber, prepared the flintlock, and pulled the trigger for every discharge. Human effort powered the sequence, so the weapon could not produce the continuous burst suggested by the modern term. Yet the label cannot be dismissed entirely. A 1722 record referred to machine guns of Puckle, showing that contemporaries used the phrase for a firearm organized around a mechanical apparatus. It is therefore reasonable to describe the defense gun as one of the earliest known weapons called a machine gun, provided it is immediately identified as manually operated. Terms such as revolving flintlock gun, repeating defensive weapon, or early mechanically organized firearm are more precise. Puckle was not the first person to pursue multiple shots without conventional muzzle-loading. Earlier designers experimented with revolving chambers, stacked charges, multi-barrel volleys, and other repeating systems. His significance lies in the particular combination he patented and promoted. A tripod-mounted, single-barrel weapon with detachable loaded cylinders, intended above all to stop boarding attacks. Later, gunmakers may not have copied him directly, but they confronted the same fundamental problems of ammunition, storage, alignment, ignition, heat, and sustained supply. Calling Puckle the father of the machine gun exaggerates his influence. Treating him as irrelevant overlooks the clarity with which his device embodied the desire for repeated fire. His place is in the prehistory of mechanized weaponry, among the experiments that made the ambition visible before industry made it practical. The future that Puckle could not create required changes far beyond the shape of one gun. Ignition had to become more reliable. Loose powder and separate projectiles had to give way to cartridges combining primer, propellant, and bullet. Metal parts had to be manufactured consistently enough that replacements could fit without individual adjustment. Breech mechanisms had to contain pressure safely. Ammunition feeding had to move rounds into position quickly. Heat had to be controlled. Factories had to produce weapons in numbers large enough for armies to train, supply, and repair them. During the 19th century, these conditions slowly emerged. Percussion systems reduced dependence upon exposed priming powder and flint. Revolvers made rotating cylinders practical in personal weapons. Breech-loading rifles allowed soldiers to load from the rear. Metallic cartridges sealed the chamber and simplified handling. Industrial machinery improved standardization. The Gatling gun used a hand crank to rotate multiple barrels through loading, firing, extraction, and cooling cycles. Like Puckle's weapon, it remained manually powered, but its cartridge feed and manufacturing belonged to a new technological world. The Maxim gun went further by using the energy of recoil to operate the firing cycle automatically. One shot helped prepare the next. This was the decisive transformation Puckle had not achieved. His operator supplied the motion. The Maxim mechanism captured energy from firing itself. The result was a sustained rate of fire that changed tactics, fortifications, colonial warfare, and eventually the battlefields of the First World War. It would be inaccurate to claim that these weapons descended directly from the defense gun. Their designers solved problems through different mechanisms and industrial resources. Yet Puckle's project foreshadowed the central military ambition behind them. Allowing a small crew to produce concentrated fire greater than ordinary muzzle-loading weapons could deliver, this ambition was not morally neutral. Increased firepower promised protection to defenders and slaughter to attackers. A machine that saved one ship's crew could destroy another group of human beings more efficiently. As rapid-fire technology improved, the scale of killing expanded far beyond the boarding actions Puckle imagined. His gun therefore points toward a future that is technically impressive and historically terrifying. The distance between 9 manually produced shots per minute and hundreds of automatic rounds per minute was not only a story of engineering progress, it was a story of institutions learning to organize industrial violence. Puckle stood near the beginning of that long process, not because his gun caused it, but because his design made the desire visible. A cylinder of prepared chambers promised that time between shots could be reduced through machinery. Later generations would pursue that promise until the delay became almost invisible. James Puckle did not live to see those later developments. He died in 1724, only a few years after the patent and public demonstration that defined his mechanical reputation. By then, the defense gun had not entered mass production. The British Armed Forces had not adopted it as standard equipment. Investors had not created the flourishing company he hoped to build. At least a small number of guns existed, and a powerful patron had purchased examples, but the project remained commercially unsuccessful. It would be easy to invent a tragic final scene in which Puckle looked upon his rejected machine and predicted that future centuries would understand him. No evidence supports such a moment. The truth is quieter and more revealing. He died as many inventors die, with part of his idea embodied in working objects and most of his ambition unrealized. He could point to a patent. He could point to a demonstration. He could point to the guns connected with the Montague expedition. He could not point to naval contracts, battlefield reports, or factory turning out cylinders in large numbers. His failure was neither total nor simple. The machine functioned, but the system around it did not. The legal claim succeeded, but the market failed. The demonstration succeeded, but adoption failed. These mixed outcomes are common in technological history, though later storytelling prefers clean categories of genius or fool. Puckle was neither a magician who invented the future, nor an absurd dreamer whose machine did nothing. He identified a real problem and built a difficult answer with the resources of his age. That answer remained too expensive, too uncertain, and insufficiently supported to spread. And the gap between his vision and practical adoption was filled by manufacturing limits, institutional caution, and the availability of simpler weapons. Death fixed the project in this unfinished state. Puckle could no longer refine the design, search for patrons, or respond to criticism. The defense gun became an object without an active advocate. Most failed inventions disappear at this point. Prototypes are dismantled. Metal is reused, papers are lost, names vanish. Puckle escaped that fate because the patent survived. The story attracted curiosity, and several guns were preserved. His commercial failure became the foundation of his later fame. A weapon that had armed fleets might have become one item among many in naval records. A rare machine that appeared to anticipate a distant future became a historical mystery. The surviving Puckle guns carry a form of authority that printed claims cannot provide. They show that the defense gun was not merely an illustration, a rumor, or a promotional fantasy. A viewer can examine the barrel, cylinder, tripod, screw, and lock, and see how the system was intended to work. The metal bears the decisions of its makers. The spacing of the chambers, the shape of the supports, and the arrangement of handles reveal compromises hidden inside the patent's clean lines. Surviving examples associated with historic Montague collections connect the object to the Duke who supported Puckle's venture. Other examples and later replicas have helped museums and historians explain the design. Preservation, however, creates its own questions. An object may have been restored, repaired, assembled from parts, or displayed in a condition different from its original operational state. A museum label condenses debate into a few sentences. A replica may function more smoothly because modern makers understand where the original suffered. Demonstrations using reproductions can show principles, but cannot perfectly recreate 18th century powder, craftsmanship, wear, and handling. Even so, the guns remain extraordinary survivors. Experimental weapons are especially vulnerable to disappearance. Their components are valuable. Their owners lose interest, and later generations may regard them as obsolete curiosities. The fact that Puckle's machines endured allows historians to test written descriptions against physical evidence. It also encourages myth. A visitor sees a revolving cylinder behind a long barrel and immediately thinks of later machine guns. The resemblance is real, but visual similarity can produce false continuity. The surviving object must be read in its own technological language. Flint, loose powder, manually prepared chambers, screws, hand rotation, and craft fitting. It belongs to the age of sail, not the age of belts and cartridges. Its tripod does not point directly toward the trenches of the 20th century. It points toward a question that many inventors would answer differently. That is why the object remains powerful. It is familiar enough to seem prophetic and strange enough to reveal how far technology still had to travel. Standing before it, one can imagine the confidence required to promote such a device in 1718. One can also imagine the doubts of an ordnance officer studying the same mechanism and calculating everything that might fail at sea. James Puckle's reputation has usually been pulled between two extremes. In one version, he is a forgotten genius who invented the machine gun more than a century too soon. In another, he is the promoter of an impractical curiosity, remembered mainly for square bullets and disappointed shareholders. Neither account is sufficient. The defense gun did not fire automatically, did not enter mass production, and left no confirmed record of combat service. At the same time, its revolving cylinder, tripod mount, detailed patent, and public demonstration represented a serious response to a real tactical problem. The most useful judgment is to treat it as an important experimental artifact. Clever enough to function, demanding enough to resist widespread adoption, and revealing precisely because it failed. This distinction separates invention from innovation. An invention may introduce a new mechanism. An innovation must also become affordable, reproducible, maintainable, and useful within an existing institution. Puckle achieved the first, in a limited but genuine sense. He secured legal protection, commissioned working guns, demonstrated repeated fire, and attracted at least one wealthy patron. He never completed the larger transformation required to place the weapon aboard British ships in significant numbers. Seen in this way, failure becomes evidence. The mechanism exposes the limits of early 18th century precision. The unsuccessful company shows that performance alone could not overcome financial uncertainty. Official hesitation reminds us that armies and navies adopt systems, not isolated moments of ingenuity. The ammunition proposal demonstrates that technical imagination can carry prejudice as easily as progress. Puckle's strengths and weaknesses were therefore thoroughly human. He recognized an opportunity to reorganize the timing of fire, but overestimated the readiness of both technology and market. His machine was ingenious, troubling, functional, and unsuccessful at the same time. It also opens a wider view of Britain. The country's prosperity increasingly depended on maritime commerce, and private capital was becoming closely entangled with national ambition. Puckle patented his design, promoted it in print, formed a venture, courted investors, and sought aristocratic support. Defense became a business proposal. The weapon promised protection for British cargo and sailors, while success promised profit for shareholders. The patent converted mechanical knowledge into temporary property and, by describing the invention in detail, preserved it for later generations. The project also revealed the boundary between craft and industry. London's finest workers could construct an intricate revolving gun, yet the economy could not reproduce and support it cheaply enough for mass service. Popular satire showed that the public understood the gap between spectacular claims and commercial reality. Above all, the defense gun stood at the intersection of law, commerce, empire, religion, and organized violence. It mattered not because of a battle it won, but because of what people hoped it might accomplish. Return, finally, to the merchant ship beneath the gray sky. Small boats advance through the haze, sailors raise their muskets, and the strange tripod-mounted weapon waits by the rail. The operator turns its cylinder and prepares the next chamber. It is a powerful image, but it remains an imagined one. No surviving record confirms that a Puckle gun ever broke a boarding attack or saved a ship. History gives us something quieter. A patent from 1718, a handful of surviving machines, a reported trial of 63 shots in 7 minutes, limited patronage, and a commercial failure. From those fragments, a more honest story emerges. Puckle did not create the modern machine gun. He created an early answer to the question of whether mechanism could help a small crew deliver repeated fire faster than conventional muzzle loaders allowed. His answer worked under demonstration conditions, yet depended on too many fragile links: dry powder, a sharp flint, aligned chambers, intact threads, expert craftsmen, trained operators, willing investors, and supportive officials. Later generations removed many of those obstacles through percussion ignition, metallic cartridges, standardized parts, mechanical feeding, and automatic cycling. The result transformed warfare on a scale far beyond anything Puckle's boarding gun could have achieved. That future was not his invention, but his machine pointed toward the ambition behind it. Today, the surviving defense guns stand silent. Their cylinders no longer turn. Their flints no longer strike steel, and the fleets they were meant to protect have vanished. Even so, they remain eloquent. They remind us that technological history is shaped not only by devices that conquered markets and battlefields, but by ambitious failures that exposed the problems later inventors would have to solve. James Puckle built no arsenal, founded no lasting weapons industry, and won no documented naval victory. What he left was a question in iron and brass. How much violence could human hands organize through a machine? In 1718, Britain listened to the repeated shots and declined to buy the answer. 3 centuries later, the question still echoes.